13-year-old Lexi had always been a loner. Not the kind who brooded under stairwells or skulked behind library shelves, but the kind who saw the world differently. Where her classmates saw rules and boundaries, Lexi saw possibilities. Her teachers called her imaginative to a fault, her parents stubbornly curious, but Lexi thought of herself as a treasure hunter in a world full of secrets. Her hometown of Rivermist was as ordinary as they came. Nestled in a lush valley flanked by pine-covered hills, the town thrived on its logging industry and the river that sliced through its heart. But Rivermist's charm was deceptive. The river, a lifeline for the town, had been swelling ominously over the past few weeks, thanks to an unrelenting monsoon season. Rumors of floods crept through school hallways and grocery store aisles like shadows, but no one took them seriously, not until the sirens wailed. It was mid-afternoon when Lexi first heard them. She was perched on her favorite spot, an old oak tree near the edge of the river, sketching a dragon in her battered notebook. Her pencil froze mid-stroke as the sharp, eerie cry of the flood alarms shattered the usual symphony of birdsong and rustling leaves. A cold dread settled in her stomach. She climbed down quickly, her boots squelching in the damp earth, and hurried home. Her house, a modest two-story structure with peeling white paint, sat at the edge of town, close enough to the river to be at risk, but far enough that her parents had brushed off any concerns. Inside, her mom was already packing a bag. "Just in case," she said, her voice tight. Lexi's dad was boarding up the windows, his usual calm demeanor strained. "We'll head to the community center if the water gets any higher," her mom explained, not meeting Lexi's eyes. Lexi didn't ask questions. Her parents always acted like they had everything under control, but she could tell they were scared. That was new, and it scared her, too. By nightfall, the rain was a living thing. It hammered against the roof and windows, turning the world outside into a distorted, shimmering blur. Lexi lay awake in her room, listening to the drumming rain and the distant roar of the river. Her mind wandered to the stories she'd heard about the floods of decades past, waters so fierce they swallowed whole neighborhoods. She tried to imagine what it would feel like to be surrounded by that much water, the ground disappearing beneath her feet. Sleep came in fits and starts, and when she woke, it was to chaos. Water lapped at the edge of their yard, brown and churning. Her parents were frantic, shoving essentials into bags and shouting over each other. "The community center's on higher ground," her dad said. "We'll be safe there." They left quickly, joining a stream of neighbors making their way uphill. Lexi clutched her notebook tightly, her heart pounding as she glanced back at their house. It already looked smaller, more fragile, against the rising tide. The community center was crowded and noisy, filled with the hum of worried conversations and the occasional cry of a baby. Lexi found a corner near a window and tried to lose herself in her sketches. But the world outside was impossible to ignore. The rain was relentless, the river's fury visible even from this distance. It was later that evening, as the storm's intensity reached its peak, that Lexi saw it. She had slipped outside for a moment, unable to stand the suffocating atmosphere of the shelter. The air was cool and heavy with the smell of wet earth and pine. She wandered toward the edge of the hill, her boots sinking slightly in the mud, and looked down at the swollen river. Something moved. At first, she thought it was debris, a tree branch or a piece of someone's fence. But then it shifted against the current, struggling. Lexi squinted, her breath catching. It wasn't debris. It was a creature, small and dark, flailing in the water. She couldn't make out details, but it was alive. Without thinking, she ran back to the shelter, grabbing a flashlight and the emergency rope her dad had packed. She ignored the startled questions from her parents and darted back into the storm. Her heart raced as she made her way down the slippery hill, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. She reached the riverbank and scanned the water, her pulse hammering in her ears. There it was. Closer now, caught against a cluster of rocks. It was smaller than she'd thought, no bigger than a dog. Its shape was strange, too, almost reptilian. She hesitated for only a moment before tying the rope around a sturdy tree and wading into the freezing water. The current tugged at her legs, and she struggled to keep her footing. As she got closer, the creature's features became clearer. Its body was covered in sleek, iridescent scales that shimmered even in the dim light. Its wings were tangled in debris, and its large, luminous eyes fixed on her with a mix of fear and desperation. A dragon, she thought, her mind reeling. A baby dragon. She reached out, her hands trembling. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the river. "I've got you." The river fought her every step of the way. It was a force of nature, cold and unforgiving, its currents determined to sweep away anything that dared oppose them. Lexi gritted her teeth and pushed forward, clutching the rope with one hand and stretching the other toward the struggling creature. The baby dragon, and it was undoubtedly a dragon, let out a pitiful, warbling cry that sent a shiver down her spine. Its scales glimmered faintly, even under the harsh beam of her flashlight, reflecting a kaleidoscope of colors that seemed impossibly vibrant for something on the verge of drowning. Her boots slipped against the slick rocks beneath the surface, and for a moment, she thought she'd lose her balance. The water surged up to her waist, then her chest, icy fingers clawing at her clothes. She took a deep breath and steadied herself, anchoring her foot against a jagged stone. "Stay with me," she murmured, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to the dragon or herself. When she was close enough, she saw the debris tangled around the dragon's wings, a mess of fishing lines, twigs, and strips of plastic that had likely been swept downstream by the storm. Lexi reached out cautiously, her fingers brushing the edge of the creature's wing. It flinched, its eyes wide with fear, and she felt an inexplicable pang of guilt. Hey," she said softly, forcing calm into her voice. "I'm not going to hurt you. Let me help." The dragon stilled, though its trembling didn't stop. Lexi began untangling the mess, working quickly despite her numb fingers. The fishing lines were the worst, cutting into the delicate membranes of its wings. Blood seeped into the water, swirling around them like ink, and Lexi's stomach turned. She tore the lines away as gently as she could, whispering soothing nonsense as the dragon whimpered. It took what felt like an eternity, but finally, the last of the debris came free. The dragon's wings unfolded weakly, their translucent membranes catching the light in a way that made Lexi's breath hitch. She knew she had to get it out of the water, and fast. Looping an arm under the dragon's body, she held it close and began the treacherous journey back to the riverbank. The creature's scales were surprisingly warm against her soaked clothes, a stark contrast to the freezing water that clawed at her legs. It was heavier than she expected, its limp form pressing against her chest as she struggled to keep her footing. Every step was a battle, the current relentless and unyielding. When she finally reached the bank, she collapsed onto the muddy ground, gasping for air. The dragon lay sprawled beside her, its chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. For a moment, they both simply lay there, two drenched, exhausted figures under the relentless downpour. Lexi pushed herself up on trembling arms and took a closer look at the creature. Its scales were even more stunning up close, shifting between shades of emerald, sapphire, and gold with every tiny movement. Its eyes, now half-lidded, were the color of molten amber, glowing faintly even in the dim light. She reached out hesitantly and brushed her fingers against its snout. It didn't pull away. Instead, it let out a low, tired rumble that vibrated through her hand. "You're real," she whispered, the words barely audible over the rain. "You're actually real." The dragon's gaze met hers, and for a moment, she felt something she couldn't explain, a connection, as if the creature understood her words. It blinked slowly, then tucked its head against her arm, seeking warmth. Lexi's heart clenched. She looked around, her mind racing. The river wasn't safe, and neither was the open hillside. The dragon needed shelter, somewhere dry and hidden. She thought of the old shed near the edge of the woods, a forgotten relic from when Rivermist had been a farming town. It wasn't far, and it would have to do. "All right," she said, more to herself than the dragon. "Let's get you somewhere safe." Hoisting the creature into her arms, Lexi stumbled to her feet. Her legs ached, and every muscle in her body protested, but she didn't stop. The shed wasn't far, just a few hundred yards, but every step felt like a mile. The rain didn't let up, and the muddy ground threatened to pull her down with every step. By the time she reached the shed, her breath was coming in ragged gasps. She kicked the door open and staggered inside, collapsing onto the dry wooden floor. The dragon whimpered softly, and she placed it gently on an old blanket she found in the corner. "There," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You're safe now." The dragon curled into a tight ball, its wings folding around its body like a cocoon. Lexi sat beside it, her back against the wall, and closed her eyes. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to breathe. She didn't know what would happen next, but for now they were safe, and that was enough. The rain finally eased by morning, tapering off into a soft drizzle that made the air feel heavy and clean. Inside the shed, Lexi stirred awake, stiff and sore from the night's ordeal. The first thing she saw was the dragon, still curled up on the blanket in the corner. Its chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, the warmth of its breath fogging the air around its snout. For a fleeting moment, Lexi wondered if the events of the previous night had been a dream, but the ache in her muscles and the mud crusted on her clothes told her otherwise. She pushed herself upright, brushing a damp strand of hair from her face. The shed was dimly lit, with sunlight filtering weakly through cracks in the wooden walls. It smelled of mildew and old hay, but it was dry and relatively warm. Lexi glanced at the dragon again. It hadn't moved much, though its wings were now tucked neatly against its sides. The cuts and scrapes along its body looked less severe in the daylight, but they still made her wince. "I guess you're not flying out of here any time soon," she murmured. Her voice sounded strange in the quiet, almost intrusive. The dragon's ears twitched at the sound, and its eyes fluttered open. For a moment, it just stared at her, its amber gaze sharp and unblinking. Then it shifted slightly, letting out a low, hoarse chirp that made Lexi's heart squeeze. "Hey," she said softly, holding her hands out in what she hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "You feeling okay?" The dragon's head tilted, its gaze flicking between her and the open door behind her. It seemed to relax a little, though it didn't move any closer. Lexi took that as a good sign. She leaned back, letting her arms rest on her knees, and studied the creature more closely. Its scales were incredible, shifting colors with the faintest movement, and its wings, even tattered, looked strong enough to carry it across the sky once healed. It was beautiful, otherworldly, and completely alone. "Where did you even come from?" she wondered aloud. The dragon didn't answer, of course, but it made another soft sound, almost like a sigh. Lexi frowned, her mind racing with questions. Did it have a family out there somewhere? Were there more of its kind? She'd never heard of dragons outside of fairy tales, but here one was, as real and tangible as the mud under her boots. The thought made her head spin. Her stomach growled, breaking the silence. She winced and glanced at the dragon, half expecting it to judge her. Instead, it blinked slowly, unbothered. Lexi sighed and stood, brushing dirt from her jeans. "All right, stay put. I'll see if I can find something for both of us." She stepped outside, squinting against the pale morning light. The storm had left the landscape drenched and disheveled. Branches littered the ground, and puddles reflected the gray sky. The woods surrounding the shed were eerily quiet, as if the storm had stolen the voices of the birds and insects. Lexi shivered and wrapped her arms around herself, heading back toward the community center. She'd have to be quick. If her parents noticed she was gone, there'd be trouble. The center was still crowded, though the tension from the night before had eased slightly. People milled about, talking in low voices or sorting through supplies. Lexi slipped inside unnoticed and made her way to the corner where her family's bags were stashed. She grabbed a can of soup and a bottle of water, hesitating only briefly before stuffing an extra blanket under her arm. No one stopped her as she left. The walk back to the shed felt longer than it had the night before. Her mind churned with possibilities, questions she couldn't answer. What would happen if someone found out about the dragon? Could she even keep it hidden? She shook the thoughts away and quickened her pace. One step at a time, she told herself. Just get through today. When she returned, the dragon was sitting up, its head tilted, as if listening for her approach. Lexi paused in the doorway, struck again by how surreal the whole situation was. The creature looked at her, and she could have sworn there was something expectant in its gaze, as if it had been waiting for her. "Miss me?" she joked, stepping inside. She set the supplies down and opened a can of soup, using an old metal pot she'd found in the shed to heat it over a small fire she'd managed to build. The dragon watched her intently the whole time, its nostrils flaring as the scent of food filled the air. "I don't know what you eat," Lexi admitted, pouring some of the soup into a shallow dish and sliding it toward the dragon. "But you've got to be hungry, right?" The dragon sniffed the dish cautiously, then dipped its snout in and took a tentative sip. Lexi smiled, relief washing over her. "See, not so bad." She ate her portion in silence, glancing at the dragon every so often. It seemed to be relaxing, its body less tense and its movements more fluid. When it finished eating, it stretched its neck and let out a soft trill that sounded almost like gratitude. Lexi chuckled. "You're welcome," she said. She leaned back against the wall, feeling a strange sense of contentment. The dragon curled up on the blanket again, its eyes drifting shut. Lexi watched it for a while, her own eyelids growing heavy. She still didn't know what she was going to do, but for now, they were both safe, and that was enough. The shed door creaked open, and Lexi froze, the sound jolting her out of a half-dream. Her heart pounded as she turned toward the noise, half expecting to see her parents or someone from a community center. Instead, the figure in the doorway was a stranger. The man, if he could even be called that, stood unnaturally tall, his frame draped in a dark, weathered coat that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. His face was obscured by the hood he wore, but Lexi could feel his gaze piercing through the shadows, scanning the room with unnerving precision. Her instincts screamed at her to hide the dragon, but there was no time. The creature lay curled on the blanket beside her, its chest rising and falling peacefully, completely unaware of the new presence. "You have something that doesn't belong to you," the stranger said, his voice low and smooth, like water over stones. Lexi's throat tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, hoping her voice didn't betray her fear. She shifted subtly, placing herself between the man and the dragon. The stranger stepped into the shed, his movements fluid and deliberate. He raised a gloved hand and pointed directly at the creature. "That," he said simply. "It's not safe here. You've done well to keep it alive this long, but you have no idea what you're dealing with." "And you do." Lexi shot back, her voice sharper than she intended. She regretted it immediately, but the man only chuckled softly. "More than you could possibly imagine," he said. He crouched slightly, bringing himself closer to her eye level. "Listen carefully, child. That creature is not a pet. It's not a curiosity or a project for you to nurture. It's a beacon. And if you don't let me take it, you'll wish you had. Lexi's mind raced. Every fiber of her being screamed not to trust him, but there was something in his tone that sent a chill down her spine. "Why should I believe you?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. The man tilted his head, as if weighing how much to say. "Because they're already looking for it," he said finally. "Others who are far less merciful than I am. They'll tear this place apart, and when they find it, they'll destroy it. And you—" The dragon stirred, letting out a low, warbling sound that drew the man's attention. His gaze softened, almost imperceptibly. "You think you're protecting it," he said, his voice quieter now. "But you're only putting it in more danger." Lexi clenched her fists. "If that's true, then why should I trust you with it? How do I know you won't hurt it?" The man straightened, his shadow stretching across the shed. "You don't," he admitted. "But I'm its only chance. And if you care about it as much as you seem to, you'll do what needs to be done." Lexi's stomach churned. She glanced at the dragon, which was now awake, and watching the stranger with wary eyes. She could feel its unease, the tension in its coiled muscles. It trusted her, at least, she thought it did. But what if the man was right? What if keeping it here really was putting it in more danger? "I don't even know who you are," she said finally. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a small, metallic device. It looked like a compass, but the needle inside spun wildly, glowing faintly as it pointed toward the dragon. "My name doesn't matter," he said. "What matters is that this," he held up the device, "is already tracking it. And if I can track it, so can a—" Lexi's heart sank. She had so many questions, but there was no time. She had to make a decision. The man was watching her closely, his expression unreadable. She could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her, but something deep inside her resisted. "I need more time," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just give me a day. Let me figure this out." The man hesitated, then nodded. "One day," he said. "But after that, it's out of your hands." He turned and walked out of the shed, his movements as silent as a shadow. Lexi collapsed against the wall, her head spinning. She looked at the dragon, which was now watching her with wide, uncertain eyes. "What are we going to do?" she murmured. The dragon didn't answer, but it shifted closer, pressing its warm body against her side. Lexi took a shaky breath and wrapped her arms around it. They only had one day, and she had no idea where to start. Lexi spent the entire morning pacing the forest surrounding the shed. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves made her whip around, half expecting the stranger to return early. The dragon followed her movements from the doorway, its amber eyes tracking her like a predator watching prey. It didn't seem frightened by her agitation, only curious. Maybe it didn't fully understand the danger yet. Lexi envied its ignorance. Her mind churned with questions and half-formed plans. The stranger's warnings echoed in her head. They're already looking for it. What did that even mean? And who was they? She couldn't shake the image of the glowing device in his hand, the way the needle spun with an unnatural, relentless energy. If they were tracking the dragon, staying here was out of the question. But where could they go? As if sensing her turmoil, the dragon let out a soft, crooning sound. Lexi glanced over and saw it standing just outside the shed, its wings half unfurled in the morning light. Despite the damage they'd taken, the translucent membranes shimmered faintly, catching the sun in a way that made them look almost whole again. "Yeah, I know," she muttered. "We can't stay here. But we can't just walk out into the open either. Not with them watching." The dragon tilted its head, its gaze unblinking. Then, as if responding to her words, it turned and padded into the woods, its movements deliberate and oddly purposeful. Lexi frowned. "Where are you going?" she called, jogging to catch up. The dragon didn't stop, but it glanced back at her, a soft trill escaping its throat. It was leading her somewhere, she realized. Swallowing her apprehension, Lexi followed, the forest closing in around them. The path it chose was one she didn't recognize. The trees grew thicker here, their gnarled branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy that blocked out much of the light. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and the ground was littered with moss and fallen leaves. Lexi kept a wary eye on her surroundings, half expecting the stranger, or someone worse, to appear at any moment. But the only sounds were the crunch of her boots and the soft rustle of the dragon's movements ahead. After what felt like hours, they came to stop in a small clearing. At its center stood a weathered stone structure, half hidden by ivy and moss. It looked ancient, its edges worn smooth by time, but there was something undeniably deliberate about its construction. A circular emblem was etched into its surface, faint but still visible. It reminded Lexi of a device the stranger had shown her, though the design was more intricate, almost organic. The dragon approached the structure and placed one clawed foot against it. The emblem pulsed faintly, a soft glow spreading outward like ripples on water. Lexi's breath caught in her throat. "What is this place?" she whispered, stepping closer. The dragon didn't answer. Of course it didn't. But it turned to look at her, its eyes filled with an intensity she hadn't seen before. It trilled again, louder this time, and the sound resonated in her chest. The glow from the emblem grew brighter, and Lexi took an involuntary step back as the air around them seemed to hum with energy. Before she could process what was happening, the ground beneath the structure shifted. A section of the stone slid away, revealing a narrow passage that descended into darkness. A faint, bluish light emanated from within, casting eerie shadows on the surrounding trees. Lexi stared at the opening, her mind racing. "This is the hiding place," she realized aloud. "Isn't it?" The dragon made a soft chuffing sound, as if in agreement, and stepped toward the passage. Lexi hesitated. Everything about this felt surreal, like she'd stepped into a storybook. But the stranger's words were still fresh in her mind. If they were truly coming, this might be their only chance. She took a deep breath and followed the dragon into the passage. The air inside was cool and damp, carrying the scent of stone and something faintly metallic. The walls glowed faintly with the same bluish light, illuminating intricate carvings that seemed to tell a story. Lexi ran her fingers over one of the carvings as they walked. It depicted creatures that looked similar to the dragon, their wings spread wide as they soared above unfamiliar landscapes. Others showed them huddled together, their bodies glowing faintly as if sharing some kind of energy. "Is this about you?" she murmured, glancing at the dragon. It didn't respond, but its gaze lingered on the carvings as they passed. The passage eventually opened into a cavernous chamber. At its center stood a raised platform, surrounded by pillars that stretched up into the darkness above. The same glowing carvings covered the pillars, casting the room in an otherworldly light. The dragon stepped onto the platform and turned to face her, its expression unreadable. Lexi hesitated at the edge of the platform, her mind racing. This place felt ancient, sacred even, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was intruding. But the dragon was watching her, waiting for something. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The dragon let out a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the air. The light in the chamber grew brighter, and Lexi felt a strange warmth wash over her. She didn't understand what was happening, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was something much more. And whatever it was waking up. Lexi stood on the edge of the platform, her heart pounding as the light in the chamber intensified. The dragon's hum deepened, resonating through the walls and the very air around them. The carvings on the pillars seemed to come alive, their glowing forms shifting and swirling like a living story unfolding before her eyes. A sudden tremor shook the ground, and Lexi stumbled, barely managing to keep her footing. The dragon, however, remained steady, its gaze fixed on the pillars as if drawing strength from them. Then, without warning, the light coalesced into a beam that shot upward, piercing the darkness above and illuminating the cavern in brilliant blue. From the shadows, a voice echoed, low and cold, dripping with malice. "You should have listened, girl." Lexi spun around to see the stranger stepping into the chamber. His hood was pulled back now, revealing sharp, angular features that seemed almost inhuman. His eyes glowed faintly, the same eerie blue as the light from the pillars. In his hand, he held the metallic device, its needle spinning wildly. "You," Lexi breathed, her voice trembling. "You followed us." "Of course," he said, his lips curling into a smirk. "Do you really think you could hide it? This place may shield its power, but not completely. And now, you've led me right to it." The dragon let out a low growl, stepping protectively in front of Lexi. Its wings flared slightly, despite their tattered state, and its eyes burned with defiance. The stranger raised an eyebrow, almost amused. "Brave," he said, "but foolish. You've awakened something far beyond your understanding. And now, I'll ensure it never sees the light of day." Lexi's mind raced. She didn't fully understand what the dragon had awakened, but she knew she couldn't let the stranger destroy it. Her eyes darted to the carvings on the walls, searching for some clue, some answer. The images showed the dragons in harmony with their surroundings, their glowing bodies intertwined with the energy of the world itself. "You don't know what you're doing," she said, her voice steadier now. "This isn't just some weapon or tool. It's alive. It's part of something bigger." The stranger's smirk faltered, just for a moment. "Spare me your naive idealism," he snapped. "This thing is a threat, and I will do what must be done." Before Lexi could respond, he raised the device, and a surge of energy crackled through the air. The dragon roared, its body tensing as if in pain. Lexi felt a surge of panic, but also something else, a connection. She could feel the dragon's fear, its determination, and something deeper, something ancient. "No!" she shouted, stepping forward. "Stop!" The stranger hesitated, his gaze flicking to her. "What are you doing?" he demanded. Lexi didn't answer. Instead, she placed her hand on the dragon's side. The connection between them deepened, and she felt a rush of warmth and light. Images flooded her mind, memories, feelings, fragments of a story she couldn't fully comprehend. But one thing was clear. The dragon wasn't just a creature. It was a guardian, a bridge between worlds. And it needed her help. Drawing on the connection, Lexi focused her thoughts, her will. The light in the chamber responded, flaring brighter. The dragon's hum grew stronger, and the energy that had been crackling around them began to shift, drawn toward the pillars and away from the stranger's device. "What are you doing?" the stranger demanded again, his voice rising in anger. "I'm protecting it," Lexi said, her voice firm. The stranger snarled and lunged toward her, but before he could reach her, the dragon let out a deafening roar. A wave of energy burst from the platform, sending the stranger flying backward. He hit the ground hard, his device clattering out of his hand. The chamber fell silent, except for the dragon's steady hum. The light from the pillars began to fade, and Lexi felt the connection between her and the dragon loosen, though it didn't disappear entirely. She turned to the dragon, her hand still resting on its side. "Is it over?" she asked softly. The dragon looked at her, its eyes filled with something that felt like gratitude. It nudged her hand gently, then turned its gaze to the stranger, who was struggling to his feet. His face was pale, his expression a mix of anger and fear. "You don't understand what you've done," he said, his voice hoarse. "Maybe not," Lexi replied, "but I know one thing. You're not taking it. Not now, not ever." The stranger stared at her for a long moment, then turned and disappeared into the shadows without another word. Lexi let out a shaky breath, her legs trembling. She turned back to the dragon, which had settled onto the platform, its wings folded neatly at its sides. The carvings on the walls had gone dark, but the chamber still felt alive, as if it were watching them. "What now?" she murmured. The dragon tilted its head, then let out a soft trill. It nudged her gently, guiding her toward the passage they had entered through. Lexi understood. This wasn't the end of their journey. It was only the beginning. As they emerged into the forest, the morning light breaking through the trees, Lexi felt a sense of hope she hadn't expected. The dragon walked beside her, its presence a steady comfort. Together, they would face whatever came next. And for the first time, Lexi felt ready.